Welcome to the Forest of Thought with me, Ingrid Reeser. What gets left out when we try to understand the mess the world is in through the lenses of climate change and climate science? This was something writer Dougald Hine and I had talked about over the summer and fall. It seems that discussions around climate change have become narrower, more exclusively focused on CO2 levels rather than deeply questioning our way of being in the world. And so we arrived at the question, does it still make sense to talk about climate change? The following discussion is a recording of the first public live Forest of Thought event. It was co-hosted by CEMUS, the Center for Environment and Development Studies at Uppsala University. Around 30 of us gathered on a chilly Monday evening in November at the public library in Uppsala, Sweden. And just a point of information, Dougald mentions quite a lot of references, books, and a couple of Swedish concepts. I've listed them as well as I could in the show notes, so please refer to those. All right, welcome to this evening's discussion. So the background of the podcast is sort of that I have been in and out of this field called sustainability for a while now. I used to work at CEMUS, and I started this podcast with the help of many others about a year and a half ago because I wanted there to be wanted to create a space for these kinds of explorative conversations. Actually, something that you said, Dougald, has been really helpful. You said that maybe what we need now is not necessarily the big learning institutions like universities, but rather pocket-sized universities. And so that's how I've thought about the podcast as well, as a pocket-sized university. So that's the idea behind the podcast. And Dougald, I was wondering if I could be lazy and ask you to introduce yourself a little bit.
Okay, well, hi everyone. I'm Dougald Hine. I'm originally from the northeast of England. These days I live just up the road from here in Östervåla, which is a small town in the north of Uppland, where together with my partner Anna Björkman, we are creating a school called Home, which is, as you say, Ingrid, a pocket-sized institution, which grows out of the things I've been working on for a long time, since I left my early career at the BBC, what's coming up for 20 years ago, and sort of went looking for other ways of telling stories. So I've worked as a writer and a storyteller, and also creating projects in collaboration with various different people. Probably the one that's best known these days is the Dark Mountain Project, which grew out of a conversation that I had with Paul Kingsnorth, which led the two of us to write a manifesto together, asking some questions about our experiences in the environmental movement, about whether at that point, and we're talking 14 years ago now, whether we were being honest about the depth of the trouble that the world is in, and whether we needed other ways of talking about that trouble, and not least, other ways of talking about the role that culture plays within that. So I worked a lot with artists and writers around that. I spent 2 years working with Riksteatern, Sweden's touring national theatre, as leader of artistic development, which grew out of that work, not least around climate change and the role of culture under the shadow of climate change. So that's probably enough for a beginning.
Yeah, and I was just lucky enough to visit this budding school called Home, and yeah, really look forward to seeing the things that you guys are going to do up there. So the question that we are sort of going to try to explore today is the title that we put out. Does it still make sense to talk about climate change? And so is climate change and climate science, are they useful starting points for conversations about the mess that we're in, the trouble that we're in? But I think that in order to start asking that question, maybe we need to talk a bit more about the journey that led to them and why it's significant that you're sitting in this chair, Dougald, because you're somebody who has talked about climate change incessantly for the past 14 or 15 years. So maybe you could, and you've said that, you have this, and maybe a lot of people have this, oh fuck moment when it comes to climate change, where sort of the gravity of it sort of sets in. So I thought, could we start from there, from that moment, and could you take us a bit on the journey that set you on, which has now led you to sit here in this chair and ask this question?
Yeah. So I have a distinct memory of somewhere around, I suppose it was probably 2005. Climbing over the desks in the newsroom at the radio station where I was still working off and on. I was the last person in at the end of a late shift, and I was climbing up on my colleagues' desks to switch off all of these overhead screens that they'd been leaving on when they'd gone home. And I was in that phase, which some of you will probably recognize from the early months after climate change gets real to you and stops being just something you vaguely know about and see out of the corner of your field of vision, one of the things on a list of all of the things that are wrong in the world, and becomes the thing that's keeping you awake in the middle of the night. And that's what I sort of describe as when you cross that line from, oh yeah, climate change, to, oh fuck, climate change. And often in that initial phase, your behaviors might be things that under other circumstances would tick a number of boxes on a diagnostic form for a psychiatrist. Generally speaking, thinking of the small habits of our daily routines as connected to the fate of the planet is regarded as a sign of incipient psychosis, except when it comes to the environmental crisis, at which point it becomes the form in which we are invited to think about the connection between our lives and the mess that the world is in. And I'm not saying that that's a mistake. Actually, I think going out of our minds a little might be a very healthy reaction to the point when it sort of starts to dawn on us in a visceral way rather than an arm's length factual way, the gap between how our societies are acting and what we already know at a factual level, and what we already knew in 2005 at a factual level about the depth of the shit we were in. So that was my kind of oh fuck moment. And what I remember from the kind of journey from there onwards was there's a point a little bit further on where you cross another threshold, because it begins to occur to you that you could change every light bulb within reach, and you could convert as many of your friends as possible to doing more recycling, and you could stop flying, and you could tick all of the boxes on the list at the end of Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth. And it still might not be enough. And you realize that in that first wave of reaction, you've hit you've been acting as if you've got some secret deal with the universe, where if you and everybody you know do enough of the right things, we can just make all of this go away. And I guess it was somewhere after that, and at a stage where I'd been fairly involved in climate activism as well as in journalism, that I crossed paths with Paul, and we began to have the conversations that led to Dark Mountain, which were partly guided by a sense that a lot of the activism we'd been involved in and seen other people involved in had a kind of quality of distraction activity, that it could be a way of keeping ourselves busy enough to distract us from that voice in our heads in the middle of the night. And so Dark Mountain started as a place where you could come to have the conversations that you were having quietly in your head when you couldn't sleep with other people, without there being a rush to action or to answers, and without being made to feel guilty for expressing doubt or fear or despair or uncertainty. And because of that, I became somebody who spent a lot of my life talking about climate change, not in the sense of being one of the people who go around trying to explain the facts to people, but maybe one of the people who go around trying to clear up the mess where the expertise that is really helpful for setting out and communicating the facts reaches its limit and something else is called for, some other kind of space, some other kind of conversation is called for. So I guess that's why it's strange to me to have realized in the last few months that I'm questioning in a way I haven't done before whether it still makes sense to talk about climate change.
Well, it means that it has been useful for you as an entry point into these deep conversations. So could you say why that was, and then why it might not be anymore for you?
So it has seemed to me to be helpful because it's very often the point at which people, at least in the kind of privileged Western circles that are mostly represented in a room like this tonight, it's often the point at which the veneer of modernity and progress begins to crack. Climate change is often the place where people have the existential encounter with the sense of, oh shit, we don't just have problems that need fixing, and if we do the right set of things, we will be able to get it all back on track, and we will be back in the story that Hans Rosling was telling us, or the story that Steven Pinker is telling us about the grand upward sweeping curve of history. Climate change is often the place where people begin to doubt that. And I think that beginning to doubt that is actually the most important precondition to having the kinds of conversations we need to be having in our time. And I realized last week, actually, that there are two senses in which people talk about climate change as an existential challenge rather than a technical challenge. So climate change as a technical challenge is, right, we've got these problems, we need to roll up our sleeves, we need to come up with the right combination of innovation, technology, etc., to fix it and make it go away, or at least make it become manageable, so we get to continue some version of the trajectory of growth or progress or development, whichever vocabulary we use for it. Climate change as an existential challenge is sometimes presented in terms of climate change as a threat to the future of our species. Extinction Rebellion, which is a movement whose founders I've kind of had conversations with, and there's been a lot of sort of influence in one way or another between the work we did in Dark Mountain and where Extinction Rebellion and some of the other movements that emerged in 2018 came from, often seems to end up talking about that level of existential threat. Like, is humanity going to go extinct? The short version is probably not. But there's another subtler, in some ways more difficult version of climate change as an existential threat, which is climate change calling into question or calling time on particular ways of existence, particular ways of being human together. And it's a bit like it's not a totally helpful analogy, but it gets some of the way. The human extinction narrative is climate change as a terminal disease. The other version of the kind of existential narrative about what climate change means is climate change as a chronic disease. It's not something that's going to just kill us in 10 or 20 or 30 years or whatever Guy McPherson says today. It is something we're going to have to live with in ways that are going to cost us things that we have taken for granted, and that there's going to be a lot of pain and loss in it, and we're going to have to carry on living with its consequences. And our descendants are going to live with its consequences, just as lots of other people are living with the consequences of our way of living already, and were doing all along. So I guess, for me, that's why I've been interested in talking about climate change, because I've seen it as a kind of a doorway into a larger conversation about the trouble we're in, which includes but isn't limited to the consequences of our carbon emissions.
Yeah, and I was about to say maybe, because the way that I've been thinking about it is that climate change is more of a symptom than an actual
disease.
Yeah. Yeah, I think this is... So okay, here's maybe sort of...
I mean, we don't need to get stuck on the analogy, but it's yeah.
But the sort of the core of the question about whether it makes sense to talk about climate change is that any conversation that starts from talking about climate change starts within the frame of science. Because climate change is a scientific concept. It is framed for us by the work of science. And I'm not here to speak against that work. But equally, climate change presents us with questions that cannot be answered so long as the conversation remains inside the frame of science. And this is part of, I think, what you're getting to when you say maybe climate change is a symptom rather than the disease. To get to the point where you can think about that, you have to be able to say there are questions that lie upstream of the work of climate science, as well as questions that lie downstream of it. So we have the work of climate science giving us an account of what we know about what's going on. And then it's fairly easy to acknowledge that then there are other roles that come downstream of that in terms of delivering the message, communications, engineering, economics, etc. What's slightly trickier is to go, well, there are also questions that are outside of the frame of science that lie in some sense upstream of that are prior to rather than following on from the work of science. One question that might help bring that into focus is to say, are we in this trouble because of a piece of bad luck with the atmospheric chemistry? That the climate that our species has known during its recent history has been thrown out of whack by the emission of all of this carbon dioxide and the rest of it, in which case it's an unforeseeable side effect of well-intentioned processes in the Industrial Revolution, because we didn't know when we started burning all of this coal. Well, actually, more of it's been burnt since we knew about climate change than in the rest of human history. But that's one framing. Or one possible answer is we're in this mess because of a piece of bad luck with the atmospheric chemistry. Another possible answer is we're in this mess because of a way of approaching the world, a way of treating the world, which would anyway have brought us to this kind of trouble by one means or another, even if the atmospheric chemistry had been different, even if the IPCC were to call a press conference next week and say, folks, this is terribly embarrassing. We made an error in our calculations. It turns out we can throw out as much CO2 as we want. Things are going to stabilize in another 5 years. Panic over. If we're in this trouble because of a piece of bad luck with the atmospheric chemistry, then that would put us back in Pinker world and Rosling world. If we're in this trouble because of a way of treating the world, a way of approaching the world, then even if the IPCC, which they're not likely to do, discovered a flaw in their calculations that got us off the hook on climate change, it would just be another boundary and another boundary and another boundary where we were hitting up against the consequences of this way of treating the world. So you see, it's a real question. It's two different ways of seeing what kind of trouble climate change represents. And as long as we're talking about climate change within the limits of climate science and things that follow on from climate science, I don't think that question can be asked clearly, let alone answered. We have to move beyond the frame of the climate science to be able to see that question clearly and have a conversation about it. In other words, we have to be able to think about science and to not treat science as having done all the thinking that is needed, and now we just need to do what science says. And this begins to move us towards the question of whether something has changed that makes it potentially cease making sense to try and start a conversation about the trouble we're in from talking about climate change. And maybe that's where we need to go next in the conversation. So that's the concern that in some ways was already growing on me, although I couldn't quite name it, during this kind of flowering of climate activism that I've been in a very kind of friendly relationship with from 2018 onwards. I've had a lot of good things to say about this new wave of climate movements, and particularly about the role of the way in which feelings that there wasn't room for in the kind of climate activism that Paul and I were reacting to our experience of participating in when we wrote the Dark Mountain Manifesto. It feels like there's been a lot more room for the existential. There's been a lot more room for grief. There's been a lot more room for the power of going through despair rather than treating despair as a thing to be avoided at all costs, in the way we've been talking about climate change, thanks to Greta and Gail Bradbrook and others around Extinction Rebellion, and even, I'd have more things to say about that, but Jem Bendel's deep adaptation movement. They've opened a space that has been very much needed for a different kind of conversation about climate change. But in parallel with that, they've also been potentially getting us more deeply stuck inside the box of this thing called not just science, but the science. Unite behind the science on the placards and the hashtags of Fridays for the Future. The role of that introductory section on the climate science at the beginning of the deep adaptation paper, which is in many ways the most problematic thing about deep adaptation. There's so much else that I want to agree with and engage with, but Jem's attempt to sort of single-handedly present us with the real truth about the climate science as his way into it seems to me to be the Achilles heel of deep adaptation as an intervention and as a movement. So we already had the emergence of this thing called the science. And we've now had nearly 2 years of a pandemic in which the relationship between politics and science has been radically transformed in ways I don't think we've yet had the chance to fully absorb. Because following the science has been the mantra of politicians in pretty much every country in the world for the last 20 months. And we're in Sweden, so we've had, especially for those of you who, like me, live in Sweden but also have strong family connections and a sense of home elsewhere, we've experienced the paradoxes of this new kind of biopolitical regime, because on one side of the Öresundsbron, following the science didn't mean wearing a mask when I crossed the bridge in October last year, and on the other side it did mean wearing a mask, and we all put our masks on dutifully as we crossed the border from one country to another. And I don't want to try and say that much about the science of corona and the pandemic, because I think as Justin E.H. Smith has said, one of the depressing features of this time has been public intellectuals, humanities scholars, etc., turning into cheerleaders for particular scientific narratives rather than doing the thing that is our role within society, which might include thinking about science, which is a different thing to being a transmission mechanism for messages from scientists or policymakers in the name of science. But this is like starting to edge us towards why I think, or rather, one of the major reasons why I think it might no longer make as much sense as it did to try and start a conversation about the trouble we're in by starting from the climate science.
It's interesting. I also had the same experience as you, having grown up in Norway and having a lot of family and friends there, of these of the science being very different things, which makes it very obvious that the science is based on assumptions and exists in contexts that also have political dimensions. And it's interesting how we haven't been very good at talking about that at all during the pandemic, and maybe that's the same for climate change. And I wonder if sometimes, I mean, I think that the reason that people bring up science as their sort of main argument, have it, you know, on the front placard of a protest, is because maybe of the role that science plays in our industrialized societies, where it cannot be questioned in the same way as a moral viewpoint or an opinion based on values and so on.
Yeah.
Even though they cannot actually be removed from from their assumptions and their contexts and in certain part values, because science as we know it is based on a certain set of processes, and it acts within an economic and political context, which doesn't negate the things that that science can bring to the conversation, or that it's not important, and which of course you agree with. So I'm wondering then what people, although people do it with the best intentions to lift up science and put it front and center, what do you feel that leads to in the conversation around climate and what we need to be?
Well, I think, you know, the promise of science, and this is less the promise of the set of activities that make up actual science, and more the promise of science as it has figured ideologically throughout the history of industrial modernity, is to offer a kind of certainty, a kind of truth that stands above the other kinds of contributions that other ways of being human, other sets of activities might offer. And the funny thing is that, you know, environmentalism went down what is in some ways the dead end of this quite a while ago. Like from the 90s onwards, there was a turn within ecological politics and environmentalism away from the cultural critique that it had represented up to that point, a calling into question of our ways of living, to a sort of professionalization of environmentalism, which I think was actually primarily done with good intentions, that was a sort of way of trying to shortcut, trying to sidestep politics in order to deal with the urgency of the trouble we were in. That, you know, science is accorded this authority within our societies, and therefore, if we can just show scientifically how much trouble we're in and what we need to do, we can get past the deadlock of politics. The weird thing is that if you look at the history of neoliberalism, it actually starts with a very similar impulse to to bypass the inevitable violence of politics by putting everything through a cost-benefit analysis. William Davies has traced that deep in the roots of neoliberalism. So there's this repeated pattern of trying to use science to get past politics, to avoid the difficult work of making judgments, which is what politics involves. If instead of having to make judgments here and for now, we can put numbers on everything and weigh them up and get an answer once and for all, wouldn't that be more effective and efficient? And so environmentalism made that turn in the 90s in its mainstream forms. And 2 years ago, I was writing about this and writing about the sort of, the failure of this, and in particular what I'd experienced from talking to climate scientists, the kind of dawning on them of the gap between the rhetorical weight that science has been given in modern societies and the reality of how little weight the message from science has when it starts to be calling into question the trajectories to which these societies are committed. That, people I spoke to who'd been part of the early generations of the climate science, who'd been involved in the IPCC process, described a point of dawning horror as they realized that the politicians weren't going to keep up their end of the deal. that they weren't going to translate the message from the climate science into action in the way that was implied by the mechanisms of the IPCC. And the image I used was of the kind of Potemkin village quality of the authority of science, that actually it was just a useful ideological cover for the economic interests of our societies, and that once the message from the climate science was a threat to those ideological interests, to be a climate scientist was to have no more weight than the people holding the placards outside the summit gates. And I still think there's a lot of truth in that, but the paradox is that, fear comes into the equation, and fear creates a kind of craving for certainty, and especially the fear of politicians faced with something that they feel unprepared for. And so the promise of following the science in politics over the past 20 months is that you can hide the extent to which, even when you are genuinely trying to listen to the scientific advice, it still leaves you needing to make judgments. That science can't tell you everything. You then have to exercise judgment. And if you're exercising judgment in a situation that you weren't expecting when you went into politics, where everything has gone very weird, I can see the appeal of hiding behind the senior scientists who appear alongside you at your press conferences. I can get it. But I think it places us in a situation now where one of the things that's been going on in tandem with that is a kind of generational shift in social thinking, where there has been a kind of science envy in the younger generations in the social sciences and humanities. And you see kind of public intellectuals from that world wanting to push out the old guard and say, we need to get rid of all of this self-indulgent Foucault stuff. And, obviously we have to put Agamben out to grass now because of what he said about the pandemic. And there is this kind of gung-ho scientistic sort of accelerationist thinking that had already been gaining momentum in some parts of the intellectual left over the last 10 years, which has sort of seized the moment of the pandemic to move from tolerating other intellectual traditions that ask a different set of questions about the authority of science to saying, well, what are you going to say now, guys? Now you can stop messing around with all of that kind of self-indulgent postmodernist stuff. Now we really have to rely on the guys in white coats, don't we? So, but get me back on track.
But I'm also wondering if I worry sometimes that through the climate movement, we have emphasized how it's such a serious issue. And now all of a sudden, the big players, which you've called the grown-ups in the room sometimes, right. The people who go to Davos, the presidents of various countries, now that they're taking it seriously, seemingly, then I also get even more worried in one way, because they're going to take it seriously in their way, which is to see climate change as an engineering problem to which they have the answer. And which means, talking to people who had been at COP and seeing the amount of new projects and coalitions and so on that make it seem maybe as if a lot of things are happening, but what they're actually, and clothed in very nice words such as climate justice and rapid transformations and so on, but what they're actually about are things like geoengineering and using AI to make agriculture climate smart and doing things on a large scale, expanding carbon capture and storage. All of these solutions that are about expanding and pulling to their logical conclusion this way of being in the world that you that we tried to talk about, which it can be hard, but it has something to do with a very arrogant and harmful way of being in relation to our home and each other, our home, the earth, that is. And maybe this is, because we talked last time about how Paul Kingsnorth had written something about his son's fish tank, which kind of
right.
Which
that
kind
could
of
be a
touched
good image for us to bring this into focus.
Yeah.
So Paul's been writing a set of fascinating essays on Substack called Divining the Machine. And in one of those, he has this image where he talks about, he says, well, we had a heat wave in Ireland this summer, which doesn't normally happen. And one of the consequences of the heat wave was that the temperature was getting too hot in my son's fish tank. And we had to try and come up with a solution to this. And we discovered that the solution was putting ice cubes into the water in the fish tank. And he said, we've learnt a lot from our family fish tank. We mostly learn it at the point where we bury dead fish in little boxes in the garden with little funeral services. And you have to regulate a fish tank. You have to try and keep the temperature below a certain limit, above a certain limit. You have to measure 5 or 6 different chemical indicators of the water. And you then have like a whole chemistry set's worth of different crystals that you drop into it to adjust the different chemical levels. And he says, and all of this is a tiny part of what any river or stream or lake does easily and for free. And I think that what that helped bring into view for me was there is a vision and a project, and I think probably a well-intentioned project, of making the world into a fish tank, a thing that has to be regulated and managed, an object of total human control. And actually that extends both to the world ecologically and the world societally. And as somebody who has multiple conversations a week with journalists, scientists, designers, different people who get in touch for one reason or another, wanting to talk to me about climate change, I have felt over the last 2 or 3 years a widening gap between what I might want to talk about and where the center of gravity of that conversation seems to be. And it has to do with an assumption that increasingly governs conversations about climate change, that what we are about is trying to save the world by regulating it as a fish tank. And geoengineering is the flashiest version of that, but planting tree plantations to absorb carbon dioxide can also be part of that way of thinking. Treating the world as a thing which is or ought to be in need of human surveillance and management and control. And I think that the adults in the room is a phrase that comes from Yanis Varoufakis' very revealing book about his experiences as Greek finance minister, being in the meetings with the IMF and the European Commission and the other big players in global politics. It was a phrase that was used to him by Christine Lagarde of the IMF. It's clear that they think they are now taking climate change seriously. Greta would say it's still blah, blah, blah. So the extent to which they are taking climate change seriously enough is another question. So that would have happened anyway. There would anyway have come a fork in the road. Like as it begins to become taken more seriously, it would always have started to matter more, the different things that taking climate change seriously can mean. But that has happened under conditions where simultaneously, because of the pandemic, a kind of electric fence has been erected around the boundary of the science. And it has ceased to be legitimate to think about science. And I'm going to embarrass Per, who's sitting in the front row, by saying I find it very striking that Per made this very interesting set of radio programs for Piet a few years ago about the relationships between humans and technology, and that led into this whole kind of set of podcasts together with Eric Quilt from Piet about the history of science. In Canada, David Cayley, who's been a very interesting broadcaster, he made a 24-part series called How to Think About Science for the Canadian public broadcaster CBC, which I've been directing people to for years. These two people in countries on both sides of the Atlantic who have been considered sufficiently authoritative about the history and philosophy of science to be given hours of time on public broadcasting networks to talk about the history and philosophy of science. In both cases, have been asking questions about the politicization of science and the framing of the pandemic in public policy that put you beyond the pale of acceptable conversation now and get you dismissed as a conspiracy theorist. Because there is no room for thinking about science now. But I think that the convergence of those two things puts us in a very difficult place, where those of us who do not want to contribute to the world as a fish tank, the project of making the world an object of total human management and control, in order to talk about climate change as something other than that, because that's sort of the default place that talking about climate change will go, as long as it takes place inside the box of the science. Unless we're able to ask questions like, is it because of a piece of bad luck with the atmospheric chemistry, or is it because of a way of approaching the world? Which is a question that lies upstream of science. If we can't ask that, the default place that it will go, especially as it becomes increasingly in the hands of, the Bill Gateses, the Wall Street financiers, the world leaders, climate change is going to mean the project of turning the world into a fish tank. That project will not succeed. It's a doomed project, but it can go a long way further into dystopia before its failure becomes fully apparent. And so I guess that, this is sort of what I'm feeling the need to open up now, is what do the rest of us do if we are not on board with climate change meaning that? Then I think we can't rely on being able to start from the conversation about climate change opening a door onto a deeper conversation about the consequences of our ways of living, about the need to let go of rather than attempt to defend and make sustainable many of the things that have been taken for granted in modern Western industrial societies. Because that requires us being able to move from the science to the upstream questions, and that move is no longer legitimate in our intellectual culture in the way that it was 2 years ago.
The question is then, what might be more useful points of departure? What might be more useful starting points for having those conversations? And why don't we start with that? Do you have some thoughts?
Okay. So I feel like all of this for me is very new and a work in progress. I'm thinking aloud with you here tonight, even if it sounds at times quite strident. And I think that seeing clearly that it may be time to renounce climate change as a helpful starting point for identifying the nature of the trouble the world is in, like that in itself is a big move. It's an unsettling move for me as somebody for whom it's been the red thread in my career since my late 20s, talking to people about climate change. And those kinds of moments of renunciation, you often need to make that clear and sit with it before the implications fully arrive. Like you need to make room for a conversation about what does it mean if it no longer makes sense to start from talking about climate change when we want to talk about the depth of the trouble the world is in. But I can at least make some sort of first sketches. So if there is this trajectory, this dominant kind of default path that I think is establishing itself now, in which taking climate change seriously means the project of making the world an object of total human management and control in the interests of sustaining as much as possible of the trajectories of modernity, then what do the other projects look like? What's the nature of the work or the path that might be worth taking if you're not wanting to commit to paving that path into the future? Well, it probably has to do with what I've talked about before as the salvage work, exercising judgment, which is the thing that the utopian vision of science ideologically, as opposed to the real work of science, claims to render obsolete. Judgment, discernment, through conversation and reflection about which aspects of the trajectories and achievements of modernity we need to let go of, which it might actually be good to let go of, which of them were never as good as we told ourselves they were, and which of them are good and we want to try and take with us into as many possible futures as we can. So that begins to be, the idea of a path that assumes that the trajectories of modernity are not going to be continued. This is where Vanessa Andreotti or Vanessa Machado de Oliveira, as she's also writing her work, her new book, Hospicing Modernity, gives a lot of what we need to begin to move into a space of letting go of the attempt to sustain the trajectories and projects of modernity, and working for the possibility of worlds worth living for, worlds worth living in, on the far side of the failure of projects of control and management. We might want to go back to what Ivan Illich spoke about in The Shadow That the Future Throws, which was a conversation he had very soon after the Brundtland report. And Illich says, the places where I look for hope today are among those who are living in and making life work in the wreckage. It's like Anna Tsing's phrase about the possibilities of life among capitalist ruins. If we assume that the project of the fish tank world is going to end in ruins and is already creating ruins, and if we listen to what Gustavo Esteva and Madhusri Prakash were talking about in the 90s as the grassroots postmodernism, as opposed to the postmodernism of seminar rooms in Paris. The grassroots postmodernism is the response of people in the barrios in Mexico City to the experience of having modernization forced on them and living through its failure and having to make life work in the mess that follows from that. These are the places where we will find clues, I think, to what the sort of the small path looks like, as opposed to the big path of the trajectory of what climate change will mean for the adults in the room now.
Mm. And do you think some people would say we should rather try to reclaim the climate change discussion?
Yeah, I'm sure they will.
Yeah.
We're going to have a Q&A session in a minute. We'll find out.
You can ask, say what you think.
But I'm not interested in telling anyone else what to talk about. I'm really just trying to think aloud about finding myself in the strange position after a good 14 years in which I've been known as somebody who talks to people about climate change, of questioning whether that still makes sense. And having a suspicion that bringing that questioning process out into public might be helpful to other people. So, no doubt there will be attempts to contest what talking about climate change means. I'm simply trying to describe what I'm seeing about a set of historical circumstances which leads me to a new pessimism about the possibility of conversations that start from climate change leading to the things I think we most need to talk about, where 2 years ago I was still, relatively persuaded that climate change was a helpful starting point for getting into these deeper, messier conversations in which, as you said at the beginning, we begin to recognize that maybe climate change is a symptom rather than the disease. I think it's become a lot harder to have that kind of conversation at the same time as these kind of very powerful forces are increasingly mobilizing around and therefore going to come to define what it means to take climate change seriously.
Well, and the interesting thing there is, as well as you said, if we, you talked about the big path and the small path as ways to, there's kind of a fork in the road at this point. And the interesting thing is, if along that smaller path, like you were saying, maybe we end up finding that new alliances are also possible. Because if we start talking about what it is that the hard thing about climate change is that it's so abstract, right? It's not like what even is it? Isn't it weird that we've said that this abstract idea is as if it could be something that we could manage? It's no doubt that we are in relationship to it, and what we do will impact it. But it's the abstraction that in some ways also makes this so difficult. And so if we move forward on a smaller path and instead are interested in what a different way of relating to the world and being in the world could mean and how that is expressed locally, then maybe we will find that people who are not interested in talking about climate change precisely because they totally connect to the Davos plan for, bringing on the Great Reset, or etc. Then maybe there will also be actually a larger space for real things to happen in communities, because and new relationships and new alliances to form.
Well, it's tricky because you don't have to go far down the path of that line of thought to find that you're contemplating being in some sense on common ground with people you don't want to be on common ground with. But I think yes, if we say, right, the big path is the sort of thing that I've been repetitively describing as the trajectory towards the fish tank world, the fish tank Earth, that if the small path is all of the different kinds of activity that create conditions that allow other possibilities to survive the attempt to create the fish tank Earth and allow there to be the soil of culture, as Gustavo Esteva put it and Madhu Prakash put it in the 90s, to remake the soil of culture such that it is there as the failure of that big project continues to unfold for people to make lives in, then that does mean that you can work with people who have other priorities and who don't see why climate change is top of the list in the way that we've wanted to say it has to be. I think another thing that might be helpful in beginning to map this, like firstly, this choice between the big path and the small path is not a choice that's ever going to be presented to us on a ballot paper. It's not something that can be represented politically on the same plane in the world as it exists today, or is likely to be very soon. It's more like the thing that Karl Polanyi described in the decades following the Industrial Revolution kicking off in England in the 19th century. So Polanyi, in The Great Transformation, which is a very important book written in the 1940s, describes what he calls a double movement. So the first thing is, he says, laissez-faire was planned. Like the free market economics, despite the name of laissez-faire, was actually an ideological project imposed top down. And he says the response to it wasn't planned. It was improvised. So he says, in response to laissez-faire, which was this privileging of economic liberalism and unleashing of new artificially created markets in everything, the abolition of the kind of moral cultural, social, community constraints that had previously restrained the force of economic exchange. That was being unleashed by those at the top. Meanwhile, on the ground, in response to the devastation that was causing in communities, people who didn't have any shared political philosophy and who were not necessarily working together as part of a single movement were improvising responses to the human cost of the devastation of economic liberalism. And this is like Polanyi is offering an alternative narrative to the kind of simpler class-based Marxist narratives of what happens in 19th century England and elsewhere. And it's one that I find quite convincing. You can see it in the history of Sweden. If you look at the history of the roots of social democracy in this country lie in things that in folkbildning and folkrörelse, in a culture of self-organizing at community level that looks far more like anarcho-syndicalism than like anything that social democracy becomes once it has its hands on the levers of state. And it's those kinds of things that we're going to have to reinvent. And there are, and once we start that process, we realize that human cultures have always relied on what I would call culture in its broadest sense. Human beings coming together to do things for reasons that involve meaning, rather than simply, I'm doing it because I'm told to do it, which is the logic of the state, or I'm doing it because I'm paid to do it, which is the logic of the market. And when we have this school called home, we talk about it as a gathering place and a learning community for those who are drawn to the work of regrowing a living culture. The work of regrowing a living culture is recovering and revaluing where they have survived, the things we know about or the things we can relearn about how to come together and do things for reasons other than because you're being paid to or because you're being told to. Like all of that is kind of invisible and illegible and not worth taking seriously from the perspectives of the adults in the room, the perspectives of the Davos people. And the work of the small path, I think, in the years and the decades ahead, has more to do with spreading the rumor of that. Everything from the kind of food growing end of it that somebody like Chris Smage is talking about in A Small Farm Future, the agricultural layer of it, through to the cultural and economic layer of it that we're talking about at our school. And I see those as very much tangled up with each other. And if you look at that through Polanyi's lens and say that there are moments in history where what you have are all sorts of different things that don't necessarily need the name of a movement, but that are simply improvised responses to the consequences that are not being taken seriously of the dominant ideology, that those things don't exist, at least at first, for a generation or two, as a party you can vote for at an election. They exist as people improvising stuff in response to the chaos in their communities and connecting over long distances as well. It didn't take the internet for this stuff to be connected up across distance. You read E.P. Thompson's The Making of the English Working Class, has all these extraordinary stories about the correspondence societies in England in the 1790s, when people were getting together in rooms like this on a Thursday night or whatever, a Monday night, whatever it is, and reading a letter that had been sent from somebody in another group like that, in another town, elsewhere in England or elsewhere in Europe. Those are the kinds of practices we might need to reinvent, especially as the public space of the internet becomes increasingly policed and increasingly insane and insanity-inducing as a place to try and have nuanced and reflective, questioning, and sometimes dissident conversations.
Well, that's a good place to open up, I think, for some questions and comments from the audience. Maybe somebody would like to walk around with this.
Hello. I was just wondering, thank you for the hour and 7 minutes of conversation. Thoroughly enjoyed it. But I was just wondering if you have paid any attention to the eco-socialists who have been saying for maybe, 20 years or something, system change, not climate change. Because I think they've got quite a lot of good points.
Yeah, there are a lot of different things that can go under the banner of system change. There are a lot of different things that can go under the banner of eco-socialism. And there are sides of eco-socialism that are as or more invested in the project of the fish tank world than any member of the World Economic Forum. And so, as somebody who I think of myself as coming from the left, most of the thinkers who have formed me, whether it's John Berger or Jeremy Seabrook, or are people of the left who have been, Gustavo Esteva for that matter, who have been engaging with the questions that the failure of the promises of modernity ask of their own political tradition. Those people continue to be a source of sustenance to my thinking. And this is the difficulty with the history of the environmental movement, is that in its sort of early forms, the modern environmental movement became a cultural critique that was calling industrial society into question from the 60s and 70s onwards. From the 90s onwards, the mainstream of the environmental movement became more scientistic, and meanwhile there was also a convergence of people from the left who had not previously been interested in environmental questions, but who saw environmentalism, sometimes sincerely and sometimes opportunistically, as a vehicle for the continuation of socialist projects after 1989 and the failure of communism. And we're sort of still living with the mess of that. So there are people who would call themselves eco-socialists who I could get very deeply into this stuff with and where we wouldn't disagree with very much. There are people who would call themselves eco-socialists who would want me cancelled. And one of the things that makes it difficult for me to work with my friends on the left today is the logic of contamination and the logic of suspicion that is endemic in the left, and that has kind of some deep roots on the left, but has become accelerated. And ironically, like the best critique of this was Escaping the Vampire's Castle, written by a brilliant Marxist intellectual who's sadly no longer with us. I'm not saying that there's no role for stuff that's coming from an eco-socialist place as being helpful to the conversation I'm interested in having, but I am cautious as well. From my own experiences of it. The left has not done very much to question the project of social control as it has been implemented in our societies over the last 20 months. And that's tricky for me as somebody coming from the left.
I'll try to keep this very brief, but I remember a conversation you and I had, Dougald, a few years ago when you were at Riksteatern, and I, sort of as a side remark, mentioned to you that I don't think climate change is the biggest problem at all. And I remember you being somewhat surprised at that time. Since I've become aware of your new way of phrasing your questions now, I've thought about how come I had a different view, and I've always had a different view on climate change, and I think it has to do with my own oh fuck moment, which came very early on when I was in my teens, in the 70s, early 70s, and I was possessed by such a deep sorrow at the wholesale destruction of natural ecosystems that I cried for half a day. And since then, I've always had at the top of my mind this massive destructive activity as the main problem. And whatever form it takes, including the destruction of communities and human social relationships. So I think when climate change started to sort of rise in the headlines, so to speak, I at first I thought, well, this is good. Just one more track to pursue in the criticism what's going on. But then I started to get worried about how it was hijacked by the interests you have mentioned several times during this conversation. And one thing you said, Dougald, my final remark here is you noted regarding the politicians' reactions to the pandemic that suddenly they found themselves in actually quite personal, deep, difficult situation. I'm a politician. I have to say something. I have to do something. I have to affect how this turns out in some way. But I don't understand the science, and I've never been put in this position, and I really don't know what's going on. But I have to make a decision, and as you said, it's very easy then to turn to the science with a big S. I think what is revealed at that moment is the total lack of any education whatsoever regarding how you think about making judgments and discernments. So, one answer to the question from you, Ingrid, regarding what is to be done in this situation is, I totally agree with you regarding the small movements in various parts of the world as sort of necessary reactions to what is going on locally. But in the center, so to speak, in this destructive center of the cyclone, there are also feeling people living who has to handle this, and how can we talk to one another and reach one another? And I think the most fruitful focus here is exactly on the problem of an education in discernment, which we have to undergo ourselves on our own initiatives, and by starting with actually the exact kind of groups which you mentioned also.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're describing at the end there, Per, is kind of, it's folkbildning. I mean, I always recommend to people, there's a book by a historian, surname is Rose. The book is called it's The Intellectual Life of the British Working Classes, and it's an extraordinary history of the sort of British equivalent of folkbildning, these grassroots self-education movements from the 1790s through to the 1940s, which are the deep roots of socialism in the forms that have mattered most to me. And Seabrook's argument would be that in the British context, the sort of tragedy of the left is that the 1945 Labour government was an unfinished revolution that was born out of these grassroots movements. But instead of bringing the working class grassroots culture that had formed it and powered it into remaking the institutions of society, it became cut off from that and became a new expert layer and created a new layer of institutions that became more and more alienated from the communities in which those political movements had their roots. And in 1978, he wrote a book called What Went Wrong about the labour movement in Britain that is incredibly prescient of Brexit and Trump and all of the kind of populist movements, the roots of the support of the Sweden Democrats in this country. He saw that opening up in the British context, which has many parallels to how Swedish society has developed in the 20th century. He saw it the year after I was born. And so I feel like those of us who do want to still be coming from the left, I say I'm coming from the left because I think that the axis on which these things are framed is being cracked and broken open by the collision with planetary realities. I think Latour wrote a book called Down to Earth a few years ago, which parts of which I found very helpful in terms of the way that he was mapping the way that climate change and the Anthropocene sort of reveals the impossibility and the downright suicidal nature of both the right-wing version of progress and the left-wing version of progress, and therefore shakes open our maps of how we describe the space of politics. Where he goes with that is a lot less interesting, I think, but as the first half of that book is very good. I think if we have some kind of identification with the left and want to retain some of that, then kind of humbly going back into just how far back the mistakes of the left politically go, how far back we might need to go to salvage the most helpful stuff within our own traditions that's going to be useful in the next generation or two, like that might be a place to go with it.
Thank you very much for the conversation. I've tried for a couple of years not to talk about climate change, but I don't talk about the Anthropocene either. I talk about the environment and about biological diversity. And I see climate change as a factor underneath those words. Is the fish tank problem present there as well? Would anything be solved by talking about environment instead of climate change?
There's a lot that's been said over time about the usefulness or problems of the environment as a concept and a way of, obviously, and you will have heard this before, that one of the difficulties with it is it others the living world and sets us apart from the environment in a way that's not always helpful. I think what I would want to bring into view is the sort of entangled nature of the ecological and the cultural. When I was on the podcast before, I said modernity is always already post-apocalyptic. It's founded on the destruction, the devastation of ecological, more than human worlds, and of cultural human worlds as well. And if we can bring both of those things into view, then that maybe helps us get closer to a sense of the problem, and also of what's called for. Because the risk sometimes is that we talk about the human and the consequences of the human on the living world, and bracket out the consequences of particular ways of being human on so many other ways of being human. And because of that, we have a deeply pessimistic vision of what humans can be as a presence within the living world. We think of ourselves as a species as fundamentally destructive, as fundamentally agents of devastation. And that's not true. Robin Wall Kimmerer, in her book Braiding Sweetgrass, does a really good job of going into this from the perspective of being both a scientist and an indigenous person. And she says, I asked my students to make a list of humans having negative impacts on the environment, and they can fill a page of A4, no problem. I asked them to give me examples of humans having positive impacts, and they just sit there. And she says, it's not because that's not part of the history of humans being human in the world. It's because there's a particular way of being human in the world which, apart from anything else, removes us a long way from the impacts, positive or negative, of our ways of living on other living things, and which is then essentialized into the nature of what humans are like. And so for me, like bringing the cultural as well as the environmental into it, as a way of saying there are other ways of being human that don't attempt to control and dominate and manipulate and exploit the world in the way that we've been doing around here lately. That's one of the places I've found helpful sometimes.
Yes, thank you very much. I would like to say a thing about science. I'm a natural scientist. So I would say that science is not something that we should dismiss. We should use it in the best way to create a sustainable society. Because this planet is a fish tank. It's a round fish tank. It has an atmosphere, and we're actually fishes living in this fish tank. We do have boundaries, and those boundaries are given by physics, thermodynamics, basic science. Now, within this system, we can be either left or right, we can be forward or backward, but we have to use the science that explains what we as a species must do to be able to survive. And this is science. It's called Framework for Strategic Sustainable Development. So let's not scrap all of science, but use the first order principles of a sustainable society, and let's develop a society within those first order principles, I'd say. Thanks.
Thank you. I hope that it's clear that I have not been dismissing science tonight. I want to disagree with the claim that the world is a fish tank. A fish tank is an artificial system that only remains alive as a result of human management. Even in its current damaged condition, planet Earth is not an artificial system that only remains alive as a result of human management. And I think that with the best intentions, any response to our ecological crisis which can't see that distinction is going to lead us deeper into trouble rather than getting us out of it. And that's a case that I first heard made by scientists. I say that I've not been dismissing science tonight because I think that there's a huge difference between the science as it is mobilized ideologically and the work of science. It's not that the work of science exists completely disconnected from it and with no kind of ideological baggage or entanglement with it, but the work of science is not well served by the ideology of the science.
Time for one last question. It's from Eleanor.
Thank you. I was thinking there are initiatives about rights of nature, trying to give rights to nature, and maybe a way of subjectifying nature, to put it on another level. How useful do you think that could be in starting in another direction?
It feels like we need to try many different things, and that's certainly I'm fascinated by. Just as I am not a scientist, I'm also not a lawyer. So I watch with fascination and only partial comprehension what is going on in that work. There's a passage in Tyson Yunkaporta's book, Sand Talk, that I found really helpful in relation to that, where he has a chapter on law, and he's talking from an Aboriginal Australian point of view. And on the one hand, he's interviewing an Aboriginal Australian lawyer who is involved in work to invoke Aboriginal concepts of law in national and international law, working on a similar trajectory to the rights of nature work that people like Pelletier are deeply involved in. And then on the other hand, he talks about, we also have lawmen who are out carrying out rituals which I'm not allowed to tell you about in places that aren't on the map, that are part of keeping things going which they and I seriously believe were going before you lot came to our land and will be going when the way of life you brought is vanishing into memory. And what I loved about the way that Tyson wrote about that in that chapter was he wasn't dismissing either side of that. He was holding both of those things as things that need to go on, and I would want to do that as well. And I think that's part of what the sort of Polanyi story about the counter-movement can do, is it can say we don't have to have the kind of coherence that we've sometimes thought we needed to have on the left in order to be a movement in resistance to the things that obviously need to be resisted. We can actually have something that is more of a patchwork than that, and we don't need to waste time trying to sort out which is the right answer. As Gustavo Esteva said many years ago in the phrase that gave Paul Kingsnorth the title of his first book, one no, many yeses. We need a big no to certain powerful things, but then the things we need to affirm need to be concrete and specific. As the Zapatistas say, the world that we are working for is a world within which many worlds fit.
I think that's a very good note to end on, actually. So thank you so much for taking time to come down here today, Dougald, and thank you so much, all of you. And I hope that the conversation will continue.
As mentioned, all the references should be in the show notes. If you want to hear Dougald talk more about the idea of modernity and progress, you can listen to episode 4 of the Forest of Thought podcast, entitled A World of Many Worlds. You can find it and all the other episodes at forestofthought.com. Thanks so much to CMUS and their Critical Interference podcast for collaborating on this. You can find out more about CMUS, their courses and education and events at cmus.uu.se. It was so enjoyable to meet people in the flesh again and have these kinds of conversations. So I hope that we'll be doing that more in the future. Thank you for listening, and I'll talk to you next time.